My question is about lucid dreams and analogy with causal realm. Is it possible, as it is in a lucid dream, to manipulate the content? Is it also possible in the causal realm to raise a thought and let it reside back into the being?
In the dream state? In the formless dream state, or just in the causal?
It seems to me that this happened in the causal because the quality wasn't anything like the lucid dream state, which I've had many for about 30 years now.
Tell me a little bit about the quality, but this actually while your body was asleep?
Well, what happened was I had just about completed learning the Tai Chi form, and this night I went to sleep as normal, laid down, and I was just there, and it was vast being, nothing but being. And then I had the thought. And I raised up, I go, the thought was, wow, this is interesting. I wonder if I can disturb this. And so I started testing it with different thoughts. And each time I would bring up the thought, and it was at the same time a thought and the being together. But the thought was very distinct. You know, my own death, everything that could possibly disturb it, nothing disturbed it. And I would always reside back to that being. And then when I went out of it, I said, gee, I hope this is always going to be like this. And the answer was no. And I said, then it doesn't matter because it's always there.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good way to look at it, the last part. But that experience you're having can be extended. And what we hope to do as we continue to go into formulating the kata exercise that we're talking about, as you see, one of the versions of it is, and I'll take it all the way down. So you wake up in the morning, as one example, and you basically ask permission to speak to big mind, big heart, to be established there. Now, the traditions maintain, and our experience shows us, that in a sense, when you're plunged into formless sleep at night, that's one version of causal big mind awareness. It's pure emptiness, it's pure openness. No thoughts, no awareness. A very, very subtle I amness, not self-reflexive. Very similar, like you described. It can be described as drenched in being, drenched in fullness, but there are no real forms arising. It's vast emptiness, no matter what kind of subtle tone of bliss or love or release it might have. But as you waken in the morning, then, part of the exercise is to simply remember or recognize big mind, big heart. And we're forcing it in a sequential way, because it's an exercise. And so then you enter the strictly causal domain, which does have more form and can start to entertain very, very subtle roots of thinking. And now this is traditionally the way it is, and we'll talk about your possible exception, what that means. And then in the kata exercise, you continue, very brief, this can happen in 4 or 5 minutes. You then, still in touch with big mind and still in touch with causal release to infinity, you inhabit the vitality of your emotional self or emotional body, and actually feel that vitality coming down. And so you have a connection then between big mind, causal body, and into subtle. And I'm describing this a very kind of detached third person way. And then down into the gross body, where you get up and lift weights. But you're lifting weights with your causal body and your subtle body and your gross body. So that's one example. It's a very hard thing to do, to take it all the way down into the physical. But on the other hand, it's the simplest thing to do because it's happening all the time anyway. So the reason I bring this up is you're describing that wonderful series of experiences that starts to happen when you're sort of plunged into formlessness, as it were. And then it starts to come out into the world of form. And then sometimes you can experience losing it. Sometimes you can experience continuity. And the continuity is, it's there, and you can't continue to do that. But even if you don't, your response was exactly right. There's a simple tacit understanding that it's always there and that you have access to it.
always tried to, and perhaps this is another part of the question, should I use that as a reference to come back to? And I think I'm going to answer it myself, not necessarily. It's nice to kind of reflect on, but that experience, for me, it was a peak experience.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I've never had it before
Yeah.
or after, actually. But
I suspect it was in part triggered by some of the Tai Chi exercises you were doing. In other words, I think it was part of that because the energetic component, there's an energetic component that we're working with on gross, subtle, and causal bodies, and each of those has a consciousness component. And so you can work it from either way. But sometimes when you just do the energetic movement, it can trigger the consciousness movement, or vice versa. So I find it highly interesting that you said you just finished a certain type of Tai Chi.
yeah, I made an association with that experience to that prior practice
Yeah.
late in the evening. I
Yeah.
went home and we nearly had completed learning the whole thing, and I
Yeah.
spent another good hour out in the yard doing that.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing is that I've heard you say in the tape series with Tammy that TM is another thing, and I did that 30 years ago and did it off and on, so I made a connection with that. But
Okay.